Welcome to Governance with Gimmal, a podcast where we connect industry experts, technology partners, and thought leaders with listeners to share their insight on current market drivers and trends around information governance.
Thank you for joining Governance with Gimmal. In this episode, we will be discussing the role physical records play in a time where digitization and emerging technologies appear to be the forefront of records management and overall information governance landscapes. As many organizations are taking steps to convert paper to electronic records and information, some simply do not have the option to perform a mass conversion of paper content. While the technology landscape also continues to grow and digital transformations are certainly on the rise, many still require and find value in physical records management. A recent Gimmal survey found that nearly 40% of respondents reported that managing the life cycle of physical records was a main focus for their organization in 2022. And with us here today, we have Gimmal's very own Vice Chairman, David Quackenbush, to speak on the topic of physical records management. Hi, David. Thanks for joining us on Governance with Gimmal.
Hi, Shannon. Glad to be here.
And for those who may not be familiar with who you are or your background, especially in the records management, physical records management industry, I just want to ask for a brief introduction of yourself.
Sure. Thank you. So broadly speaking, 32 years in helping our clients solve all sorts of information management problems. When it comes to the focus around records and information governance, probably closer to 20 years directly related to those kinds of topics.
That's great. And to kind of just dig right into the topic, I talked a little bit about industries still requiring paper records or not having the option to convert paper to electronic. In your experience, why do you think there's a hesitation or simply a pure lack of need when it comes to moving to electronic records and information management?
Well, there's a couple of good reasons for that. Obviously, it'll vary a little bit by industry, but many industries, there are just a lot of assets that are considered records that aren't going to become digital. And examples could be very old types of documentation. For instance, in pharmaceutical, it might be lab notebooks or other kinds of manufacturing businesses that make products out of chemicals or some other recipe formula. Those things may be in lab notebooks that can't readily be digitized. In oil and gas, you have all kinds of different things you might manage as records that are physical in nature but aren't documents, such as core samples from a well or other types of testing results that they may maintain, as well as very old content that just either can't be digitized because of its state, maybe too fragile to digitize, or doesn't really work well in a digital form, and so it needs to maintain its physical state. So there's a variety of those kinds of reasons why physical, from a records management perspective, will always have some place in most organizations.
Great. And what about those industries that don't necessarily require physical records, but may still be hesitant to switch over to the whole scanning process and acquiring a tool for electronic records management, or fusing electronic and physical records management together?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So there's some interesting data on that one. First, the cost of digitizing documents is not trivial, and it's a well-known process. A lot of companies will do some kind of digitization of their content, and that's really where I think things get a little bit more complicated. Is, where do you start? How do you approach it? Is it a scan on demand concept, or is it we're just going to digitize the last 20 years of every file that we've, all the documents and all of our files? And so really kind of getting to a strategy for digitization is a pretty important first step. And then again, digitization of content is not inexpensive. So large organizations or organizations that have a very long-standing record. So again, take oil and gas, where you might have a well that lives for 50 years or more. You may have a lot of physical records that are still active, unused, but still active. And so trying to decide where the dividing line is there in terms of digitizing all the files becomes a big question because it's very expensive. In the millions of dollars, some of our clients have spent digitizing content.
So when we speak about the future, you talked a little bit about the organizations and the certain types of records that are still in paper format. Can you speak to, at least in your experience, the predicted future of physical records management? So at least in our time, will there purely be electronic records management approaches across the board, or will there always kind of be that physical records management aspect that organizations have to make sure that they include?
Yeah, I think there's always going to be a need for just pure physical records management. Even in organizations that have a document-only view or a view of records that would be easily made digital, there are still a lot of kind of external factors that would drive organizations to keep and manage those items as physical records as well, for a whole host of reasons, and maybe not forever in the future, but certainly for the foreseeable future, that's still going to be a reality for many organizations and many types of records that would be digital if they could. And then again, you're going to have a whole class of things that organizations consider records that just do not fit in a digital scope, and they'll have to maintain those, so for forever. I mean, there's just, in some businesses, they're just not going to be able to get away from it, I don't believe.
Can you give me an example of one of those things that can't be moved into a digital scope?
Sure. I mean, oil and gas is near and dear to my heart. So I think, there's a variety of things that happen in the oil field that are kept as records, from drilling wells, for example, and cores and things like that are samples from wells. A lot of those types of things are stored for long periods of time as records because they're utilized in legal discovery and other kinds of things if disputes arise, or if there's issues that go into the nature of an accident or something else going on at that well, or the dynamics of the well when it was being drilled, or maybe even the composition of the well and the sampling as they're taking those samples all the way down to the reservoir. So there's a variety of things like that that will be physical. Another interesting thing, and again, this is really historic in perspective, is that a lot of companies that have been around a long time that have a particular brand, or maybe business to consumer types organizations, store a lot of their historical branding in perpetuity for history and for recording history. So a lot of those are managed as records in warehouses as well. And, whether it's oil and gas or anything else, I mean, there are companies that have warehouses full of artifacts that are physical in nature that they would manage as a record, so that they know where they are and they're properly preserved.
Well, and I think that's a really good point. At one point, I had spoke to somebody inquiring about physical records management from a university who kept, just like what you were saying, artifacts that weren't necessarily documents, but were treated as records and needed to be kind of managed and tracked. So that's a really good point. So in your opinion, what's the best approach for tackling physical records today, either alongside electronic records management, which will probably be the case for most organizations, even if they have a physical records management strategy that they need to make sure that they're implementing and keeping up to date, or, for those industries that haven't quite gotten to electronic records management yet and are looking solely at physical records?
Sure. Well, this is where it gets interesting, because this is, I think, where the world of what document management is versus what records management is versus what asset management is becomes a little bit cloudy. When you think about records broadly, a category of records and a way to deal with them is really similar to asset management. I have to preserve all these records, whether they're contracts or signs or core samples or lab notebooks. I have to preserve all these records because at a value level, they represent corporate assets, number one. So being able to track and manage all that information in a similar way is important to the organization for lots of reasons. One being that it just will simplify being able to find all the things that might be considered an asset in an organization, for instance. But it also is important because from a compliance perspective, how I'm treating those assets and how am I ultimately managing their life cycle in a way that demonstrates the consistency of managing that kind of information and or asset in the organization. So there's a real good reason to think of physical records as no different in that regard than electronic records, which means they should be managed in a similar way. They should be searched for in a similar way. And a lot of organizations are starting to realize that while there might be separate systems, there needs to be some integration to support the ability to find everything when you're looking for things to get work done and or looking for things associated with perhaps some kind of discovery order or something like that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, thank you, David, for going over those key points in terms of physical records management. As we start to wrap up, what would you say are some key takeaways for organizations that need to keep up with the growing demands of enterprise-wide information governance, but also need to handle physical records as part of their strategy? What are some of those key takeaways that you want people to learn from this podcast?
I mean, I think first and foremost, today, we should be thinking about physical records the way we think about any other types of corporate information. So how am I organizing it so that it's easy to find, having it be an integral part of anything I do around information governance, because it's still information. So it may not fit the definition from a technology perspective of a binary object sitting in a database somewhere, but it's still a row in a database that catalogs where that record will be found and where I can get it. So it needs to be thought of in the same context there and part of an overall information governance foundation, number one. I mean, so that's foundational type of activity. Two, as an operation, it is its own thing. So you're still, wanting to have best practice there for using technology as effectively as possible to manage those physical assets so that it's much easier for people that have to work with them every day and or need to get to them to have an easy way of doing that and to have an accurate way of doing that so that the time to deal with and request and move those items around is as efficient as possible. Third, we all learned this from the pandemic, is physical items are an important part of the daily life of a lot of people today in the work world. So how do I deal with physical records in a world that now incorporates a lot of work from home activity? Because I can't have everybody checking out boxes and have an Iron Mountain drive to their house with a box of records. So how do I uniformly handle the need for physical items when I'm not working in an office building somewhere anymore? What's my game plan for doing that consistently, and again, consistently across the board? And how do I track those things? Because now I may be creating a broader array of places that I'm actually sending and collecting and receiving, physical items for preservation and or records management. And then I'd say kind of last but not least, just good old fashioned hygiene. The world of physical records management can be expensive because as you continue to amass large volumes of physical, you're going to be starting to think about, well, where am I going to store all this stuff? And corporate real estate can be expensive. So trying to have a lot of that on site, as most companies have already figured out, can be not very cost effective. And you need to find less expensive places to store that information, but also that it's easily accessible so that you can get and retrieve the information you need to use in a fairly expedient manner. So just like anything else, there's got to be some investment, there's got to be some kind of evergreen process improvement to ensure that best practice is being applied and that you're maintaining the hygiene of that information to improve its quality and its usability.
Great. Well, thank you again, David, for joining us today. For our listeners, if you'd like to learn more about the state of physical records today or how to implement a physical records management approach, please check out our related resources